Thanks so much. Welcome to Build. I am your host, Ricky Camilleri. In 2005, crime novelist Don Winslow set out to tell the story of the war on drugs with his book, The Power of the Dog. 10 years later, he returned with The Cartel, and now Winslow brings us The Border, the final, maybe, book of the trilogy, where we find his conflicted hero, Art Keller, now running the DEA and the disrupted cartels in Mexico, warring with each other over power. Now, to say these books are just crime novels using the drug war as a backdrop is to really miss the point. Winslow, with these three novels, does what journalists often cannot do. He uses fiction to provide a story which gives incredible context to America's longest-running war. And he's here with me right now. Don Winslow, everybody. Let's hear it.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
3 books, and with the final book, I feel like no tree was spared in its production.
It's a fat book.
It's a fat book.
It's a fat book.
But an incredible read. I think I read this fat book in a shorter amount of time than I do most books. It's incredible. You can't put it down. And, I want to get into why this, how this started, how you do your research. But just as a writer, I am so fascinated with how you made a captivating thriller out of systemic corruption and out of backroom deals in the government within Mexico. As opposed to the other 2 books, there's very little actual war and there's a lot of crime, but there's very little actually shoot 'em up in this book. And when there is, you get through it in like a paragraph. You clearly are not that interested in it this time around.
Yeah, I'm more interested in other things. What I want to do with this book is bring the drug war home. I wanted to talk more about America than Mexico and Latin America. There's a lot of scenes still in Mexico, but I wanted to talk about the heroin epidemic. I wanted to talk about immigration. I wanted to talk about corruption. Also, my lead character, Art Keller, is in his 60s by the time you hit this book, so it's going to be kind of silly for him to be out in the field. I had to find a different kind of war for him. I had to find that bureaucratic war, that war of corruption, that war that goes on inside Washington, that goes on inside Wall Street. So it was a very kind of different scene for me.
How different was it for you doing your research then?
Yeah, quite a bit. Some of the research I did when I was doing The Force, this book about NYPD, because I was out here on these streets with the narcotics guys and, in Staten Island and various places that this book is set. The research was a little more intimate this time. I spent a lot of time with addicts because a large part of the plot, a character named Jackie, who's a heroin addict, I was trying to get underneath the headlines. We have labels, the heroin epidemic. Oh, that's easy to say. But I wanted to bring the reader closer to the heroin epidemic by having the reader go with this woman.
I think so much of what you have to say about Jackie comes with the line that you talk about in the book, and I think it was in your, I believe it was your Esquire piece that you wrote as well recently. About Chapo, which is that drugs are a mask for pain.
Yeah.
What is ailing America that we need drugs so badly? And you very much tap into that with this character, Jackie.
Yeah, we're 5% of the world's population. We use 80% of the world's opioids, which is a staggering kind of statistic. And I think we have to ask ourselves, what's the pain? Why are we hurting? Where are we hurting that we need these drugs? Sometimes it's somebody, they hurt their back and they start taking those pills and then they get hooked. But not to those numbers, right? There has to be something else going on. And is it emotional pain, psychological pain, economic pain, racial pain? I think these are all components that have gone into making us this sort of opioid nation.
Do you think it in any way has to do with the ubiquity of the drugs as well, that the drugs are much more readily available in the United States than other countries?
Yes and no. Yeah. Again,
I wouldn't say that that's the only thing that is doing,
Look, you could stack up dope until Florida sinks into the ocean. If nobody wants it, it doesn't make a difference, right? There's no supply unless there's demand. Now, the cartels rushed to fill the demand because they realized that there was a ready-made market out here. It takes about $30 a dose of pharmaceuticals for an average addict, if that's even a phrase, to get high. And that's, depending on the state of the addiction, 2 to 5 times a day. The Mexicans created a heroin product that would get that addict high for $10. So people who were doing pharmaceuticals and can't afford it then would turn to heroin. So it was readily available, marketed, beautifully, if that's an apt description. And so, yeah, the availability was part of it. But again, it can be as available as, Hershey bars. If nobody wants them, so what?
Part of this book, as we said before, has a lot to do with systemic corruption inside the United States, up to the top levels of government. Some of that information you could glean from headlines and from articles that have been written in the past couple of years. But your book goes much deeper than that. How hard was it for you to do that research, to find those people that were willing to talk to you?
Yeah, listen, I can't balance a checkbook. My wife does all that. I'm an idiot. I'm a business moron. I watch The Profit, and I kind of learn stuff. So I had to educate myself on, various kinds of holding companies, hedge funds. So, yeah, but again, the process is always the same. Whether it's a heroin addict, whether it's a drug trafficker, whether it's a cop, whether it's a money launderer, it's a matter of going out and talking to people, hanging out, being around until they'll talk to you. So I had a lot of advisors on this, both very, very straight players who would never get involved with this and other people maybe not so much.
How do you get involved, or how do you meet these other not so straight players?
Prisons are a good place to start. Look, it's like anything else. It's about networking. Now, I've been on this beat for 20 years, right? More than that. Over a third of my life has been spent on this story, which is kind of shocking to me. And so over the course of 20 years, I've met a lot of people who will turn me on to other people. And that's
how
really
the story has changed and how it continues to develop. When I
Absolutely.
introduced the book, I said maybe last book, even though it's definitely written to be the last book of this trilogy. But there's no way it could be the last thing to say in regards to America's war on drugs.
There's no way it's the last thing to say, but it's the last thing I have to say.
You think so?
I know so.
Why is that? Why do you feel like you're done? Because you are also writing this in the midst of some of the greatest upheaval and change that we've seen in the war on drugs.
No, absolutely. Look, I didn't want to write this book.
Must have been a fun couple of years then.
I thought I was done after book number 2. I never set out to write a trilogy. I never set out to write 2 books. I wrote a book called The Power of the Dog, which was the first of these, and I thought the last of them. I was tired of the subject. The research is brutal. It's wearing.
What about it is brutal?
Look, I would spend sometimes days or weeks at a time just looking at atrocity videos and autopsies, photos. You go out and you talk to families of gangbangers who've been killed. I think during the time I was writing The Force in this book, 3 of the addicts, all young people, that I would talk to frequently overdosed, died during the course of this. Still in touch with their families. And, I have their journals. So that wears you down,
One of the characters of this book is a presidential candidate, then becomes president. His name's John Dennison. He's very similar to someone right now. I'm not sure how far we can go into saying who he's representative of. I don't want you to get sued. He's clearly a stand-in for the current president in a lot of ways. He tweets like him. He talks like him. And there is a great anger that you have that I share in a lot of ways in regards to the exploitative and opportunistic way this character, who's a stand for Donald Trump, has played off the border, as well as the war on drugs and the heroin epidemic. Were you already writing this book when that started to happen? And how did that avalanche into your book?
Avalanche is a great word. I wish I'd thought of it, I was already writing this book. I was deep into it and watching what was happening in the country, and watching us, drive toward the edge of this cliff and then drive right over it. Look, I'm a fiction writer.
Yeah.
I write thrillers. That's my job. My job is to write a good crime story that's going to interest the reader, take them places they couldn't otherwise go, be exciting, be informative. That's job number one. But I also write very close to the bone. I write about real situations, and I'm writing about our times. So it would have been stupid of me to pretend that there was another president, that it was Abraham Lincoln or FDR or Obama, although the book starts during the Obama administration, you know. So I write about my times, and I think we see a lot of systemic corruption. And I think there's a lot of corruption that goes to the very top. And so that's what I wrote.
Were you not allowed to use Trump's, would that have, or did you feel like, because I wondered, because when you talk about Obama in the book, it's fine, all and good because it's in the past. But as I was reading about John Dennison, it did feel like if you started using the actual name of the president, whether you would get sued or not, it would somehow take you out of the book, even though you know that's who it's supposed to be.
It wasn't a legal issue.
It wasn't.
That was not the issue. No, the issue was a creative issue in that I want the freedom to invent dialogue. You know, I want the freedom to do what journalists can't do or shouldn't do, you know, which is invent thoughts and feelings and again, dialogue. And so I can't do that when I use the real names, you know. And also, it is fiction. And so I want that freedom, you know, I want that fluidity, is that a word?
Yeah.
You know, to write fiction.
You know, one of the things, fiction can do so much that journalism can't and reality can't. But then there's a flip side to that as well, which is that fiction also has to wrap up.
Yep.
Fiction has to tell a full story and be satisfying, which oftentimes reality is not.
Right.
And the expectation for reality to wrap up or be satisfying sometimes leads us down, I think, dark alleys existentially as a country. I think that's how we got here in a lot of ways. How did you contend with that idea while at the same time wrapping up a trilogy?
I realized one day I had to write this book because of what was going on in the country. I had thought that the story was over at the end of a book called The Cartel, the second book. I was tragically wrong about that.
Why did you think it was over? Over for you, or just generally
over?
Why is that?
Because the Sinaloa cartel had basically won that extraordinarily violent war in Mexico. Things had calmed down, and we were in stasis. And I was ready to let that go. But then the heroin epidemic explodes. Immigration becomes an issue. We have an administration that I believe is corrupt and irresponsible and racist and all of this.
Everything awful you can be, they
Pretty
are.
much.
Yeah.
Pretty much. So, but to answer the question you asked me, which would be polite, I think, I realized that I hadn't resolved the major character's conflict. I had resolved his conflict with his major enemy, but I realized that I'd left him in conflict with himself, which was unresolved. So I knew from starting this book that the end of it would have to be this guy, Art Keller, resolving the internal conflict over the war on drugs, what he's done, who he is, who he wanted to be. And I knew I couldn't let this thing go until I'd resolved that.
Was there ever a fear that, or did you worry that when you were writing the resolution of that internal conflict, that you would inadvertently present a resolution for the overall conflict, which would essentially be false in regards to the overall conflict?
Yeah, no, because I knew where it was headed, you know. And I knew what he had to come to terms with. I don't want to give away.
Yeah, I'm being very coy here.
You are being very, very kind and clever. And so without knowing any of the other details of the book while I was writing it, you know, I don't outline.
How is that? We're going to get back to that in a second, because that's a mind blower there.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it means you're scared every day, you know.
But then at the same time, well, I guess we'll just get to it right now. At the same time, in terms of not outlining, the book is following a labyrinth of characters
Yeah.
who are involved with the drug trade, the cartel, the government in a myriad of ways. And every time I found myself thinking in my head, oh, what's going on with that other character? You were there. You were there and you were jumping on it. As an example, there's a wonderful character, a tragic character in the book by the name of Nico, who's a young Guatemalan boy who immigrates to the United States via the death train, I believe it's called, right? Which is this horrific travel from Guatemala up into the border over Mexico, where people are being murdered next to him. They're being decimated. They're being raped, and he makes it, you know. And then he has to go through the system, and it's incredible. Now that whole story is not told out in one chapter. It's laid out throughout the course of the book, while other people's stories are happening as well. And every time my brain went, "What's going on with Nico?" You suddenly drop me right back in. You know exactly when the reader wants to start following a character again. I don't know how you do that without outlining.
Rewriting. I write first drafts very fast, like I'm afraid I'm going to get caught. You know what I mean? Like the old Satchel Paige thing. You know, like someone's going to catch you at doing it, which is always an underlying fear of mine. Right, that someone's going to catch me at being a writer and say, "Well, you're not really a writer," you know, and you're going to get caught, and they'll take you somewhere.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for the guy to come through that door and be like, "What are you doing on this stage? You don't belong.
Exactly,
Get out of here.
Right. You don't deserve.
We've got a professional to do this."
Exactly. That's exactly it. So you know, I start work at 5:30 in the morning, right? And so I just start wailing away. I just start typing, and on those early drafts, this sounds rude. I don't mean it to. I don't care about the reader at all. I have no interest in the reader. I'm just amusing and interesting myself, right? It's a purely selfish act. Again, always looking over my shoulder, right, for the literary police to come and take my computer and, you know, throw me in a camp.
Is that because you know that so much of what you're writing is partially usable or unusable when you're writing in that place?
I know a lot of it's going to be unusable.
Right.
That just comes with the gig.
Yeah.
Right? There are entire days I know I'm going to throw away.
Right.
But unless I do it, I'm not going to get to the good stuff. So, again, to answer the question you asked me.
A polite man.
Try. Once I get through 3 or 4 drafts, now I start thinking about the reader's experience. Now it's not about me anymore. It's about you. It's about the reader. It's about making sure the story is clear, making sure the writing is as good as it can be, you know? And so then I start going back and I'm taking those sort of blocks. Well, I left Nico, to use your example, here. God, I haven't seen him for a while. I better pick him up here before we forget him or what happened. I haven't seen this cat for a while. I better drop that in there. And then you start building the seams between those blocks or rebuilding the seams, you know, so that it feels smooth and it feels like one ride instead of just this train that's, you know, stopping.
I can't believe you do 3, 4, 5 drafts of this book.
I did 10 to 14 drafts.
I mean, I can believe it because it's taut and it moves like a freight train. But it's massive. It's a huge undertaking.
You know, most rewriting for me is cutting.
Right.
You know, most of it is just hitting the delete key. Because I've got stuff there that's not very good or not very interesting or it's redundant. You know, and
or it's all that stuff that's leading to the story that you were writing to get yourself to.
There's a lot of preliminary, you know, twiddling around to get to it. You know, there's an old martial arts saying, "How do you carve a tiger?" And the answer is, you take a big block of wood, and then you cut away everything that doesn't look like a tiger. That's my philosophy with these books. But first, I need the big block of wood. Yeah. That's the early draft. So then I can go back and I cut away everything that doesn't look like a tiger. Now, this book, the tiger's a little fat. Do you know what I mean? The tiger's got like 5 or 6 extra pounds. Got a little Thanksgiving weight on it, you know, because there were things that I just liked and that I thought the reader would find interesting that wasn't maybe as muscular or as taut as the rest, but I ended up leaving it in because I felt that it gave it flavor and color, and as long as the reader's having a good time, I'm okay with it.
Can I ask what you think some of that fat might be?
Yeah, sure. There's a Christmas scene,
Right. Yeah.
right? Where Art Keller's wife Marisol throws a very fancy Mexican dinner party.
It's a great scene, though.
In DuPont Circle in D.C. The reason I left it in, well, one thing, here's cheap writer's trick 103 if you're looking for any. If you can find holidays or events to set scenes in, you get a lot of characters together in the same spot, which is useful, and you get this emotional bonus because these things are evocative to everybody. Funerals, weddings, birthday parties, holiday parties, you know? And I also, though, because I write so much about the Mexican drug trade and so many of the characters are drug traffickers and violence and all that, I want to show another side. You know, I want to spend some time showing beauty and poetry and wonderful food and music and people talking and relating to each other outside of the violence and the drug tension.
People having a party that doesn't involve cocaine and strippers.
Yeah. People having good food and talking with each other and listening to music and going outside and singing, you know, Mexican Christmas carols at 2 a.m. because they've invited the local cops to the party.
You know, I'm curious. I want to go back to Nico for a second, this young boy, the character from Guatemala that immigrates. Was he influenced by the rhetoric surrounding illegal immigration?
Not at first, because as you alluded to, this is a long book, and I spent a long time writing it. So I wrote Nico before the current so-called crisis.
What made the so-called crisis? Yeah.
There's no crisis.
The national emergency.
The national emergency, that's
Right.
not.
At the omelet bar. When did you start writing Nico? Was it your research on the streets of New York that brought you to someone like Nico?
Yeah, I mean, I started, because, well, I don't want to give too much away, you know, but yes. You know, it's funny how books work sometimes, you know. I never thought he was going to be a major character. I really didn't. And then one morning I'm just sitting writing him, and I just liked him so much, you know, that I enjoyed my time with him. You know, I just did. And so then I just wanted to play it through, you know, and see how it went. Long after I turned the manuscript in, then the current, you know, the caravans came up and all of that, and this subject got a lot of attention and a lot of rhetoric.
You know, as I was reading the book, I think the week that I was reading the book and I was reading Nico's story, Elliot Abrams was testifying on Capitol Hill in front of Ilhan Omar, a new congresswoman, and she was bringing up his record as the human rights chief under the Reagan administration in Guatemala, supporting the death squads of El Salvador and Guatemala. I mean, what is it like as a writer to be all of a sudden, I mean, clearly you've been working on this, as you said, for a third of your life, but all of a sudden this is plugged into everything and we're relitigating these things that came out of the past.
Yeah, you know, it's darkly funny in some ways because the revelations aren't revelatory.
No.
You know, and they're mostly false. For instance, when you talk about gangs like MS-13 and Calle 18, you know, when they say, well, there's an invasion of these gangs coming up from Central America, it's not an invasion, it's a boomerang. Those gangs started here. They started in the California prison system. And then they shifted to Los Angeles and then other cities on the West Coast. But they weren't in Central America until President Clinton had a policy of deporting these gang members. Back they go to the slums of these countries and become powerful. They become powerful because they've allied themselves with the cartels in terms of being a midshipment point for drugs coming from Colombia that are supplying the American appetite for drugs. And then with our support of various right-wing groups and death squads and all of that, we created the situation that people are fleeing from now. This is a homegrown problem, born in the USA, right? So when we use this rhetoric and this finger wagging at these countries, you know, there's that corny old saying, when you point a finger, the thumb points back at you. And that's what I'd like us to realize.
You know, you started as and you still are. You say that you wear the moniker with pride, a crime novelist.
Absolutely.
Did you ever think that your crime writing, what you wrote, would take you into these kinds of worlds?
Never. Never.
How do you think that's happened for you?
I would love to know the answer to that question. You know, look, I mean, I started this because, without bringing everybody down, you know, 19 innocent men, women, and children were slaughtered by a drug cartel in a town not far from where I live. That was 1998. And at that point in time, I had no knowledge of or interest in drug trafficking. You know, I was writing private eye stories and mob stories and surfers, you know. But I wanted to know how that could happen. And I started researching it, and the more I researched it, the angrier I got. So I wrote this book called The Power of the Dog, and then, as I said earlier, I was done. I did not want to go back. I was desperate not to go back into that world. But the situation just got worse and worse and worse, and I felt I was sitting on the sidelines, you know, across the border on the safe side, watching it, feeling that I understood what was happening. And then I thought, you know, in a fictional way, not to be grandiose about this, I could explain to American and European readers what was going on down there. So I felt I should. And then all of a sudden, one morning, just find myself typing, you know, without any real clear intent to sit down and write a book. I just started in, and that became a book called The Cartel. And I felt similarly about this book, you know, that I thought, you know what, we can talk about the heroin epidemic, but maybe I can show someone it from the inside. Talk about immigration. Well, let's take that trip with this little boy, you know, who you meet in a garbage dump, who finds a half a McDonald's in a garbage dump and wants to eat it so badly because he's hungry, but saves it to resell to somebody to help pay the rent on the hut that they live in. You know, I think if people in the United States knew that kind of story, they might view these people differently.
I would hope. But the cynic in me says that the pain of the United States, the pain that for which we desire a release, is so often the pain of feeling as if you only have what you have because you took it, and if you give anything anybody else, it could be taken from you.
Yeah, it's a zero-sum game.
It's a zero-sum game, and often I think we are reaching this point, and it has a lot to do with the president's rhetoric. I think he pushes this even more so. He brings out the worst in people, is the idea if you help that child who's hunting for the McDonald's burger to sell, you in turn at some point will be hunting for a McDonald's burger to sell.
When, of course, the opposite is true.
Of course, yeah.
When, of course, the opposite is true. My wife and I drive cross-country every year, have for the last 11 years. And we take different routes and different roads. And I have been through ghost towns in rural America. There's a post office, some boarded-up buildings, a couple of houses. The problem in much of America is not overpopulation, it's underpopulation. We could use those people. You know, we used to think big in this country.
Oh, yeah, we don't, yeah.
We don't now. You know, we talk big. We used to think big. And we used to say to people, come on in. You know, we used to say, come on in, we will give you land, and if you stay there for 5 years and improve it, it's yours.
Well, we don't invest in ourselves and in each other. We're a hedge fund. We strip each other for parts.
Do you want to hear the most shocking thing I've heard in several years? And I'm not easily shocked, man. You know, I'm not. This just set me back in my chair. I was talking to someone from the ACLU, and I got this figure. 70%, of young men going into prison do not have a high school diploma. Now, you can talk to me all day long about lies, damn lies, and statistics, but you have to account for that number, right? I think that the two dirtiest words in the English language right now, dirtiest word combination is prison privatization, right?
Which you say in the book. That's a line in the book, I believe.
Capitalization of corrections. Towns that used to compete for factories now compete for prison jobs. It's incredibly sad commentary.
And the only way to sort of keep those jobs coming is to keep those prisons full. And those prisons have also turned into detention centers for young child immigrants separated from their parents.
Yes, now we have, 15,000 at least children separated from their parents. Where is the outrage? Yeah. Where is it? Why aren't there protests down there 24/7? I think sometimes we've normalized this.
Very quickly.
I mean, think about it. Ripping a child from his or her parents and putting them in cages. What? With no plan? What are we going to do? They're there till they're 18, and then they're suddenly legal? No.
And then deported generally, right? Like
generally speaking, deported.
Often deported. I mean, and that becomes, we talk about the school to prison pipeline. This is literally the prison to gang pipeline often.
It is absolutely the prison to gang pipeline. You are traumatizing kids. You are giving them nowhere to go except to those gangs. And then you expect a different result? It's insanity, but unlike some insanity that's folly, this is insanity that is unbelievably cruel.
For the short buck.
For the short buck.
Yeah.
And then you have entities that have an economic interest, a profit motive for keeping those kids and those families in those detention centers for as long as they can.
To build new ones and to have more guards. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we have time for a couple questions from our audience.
Have I cheered you all up? Giving you a really fun, whatever day it is, afternoon?
What do you got?
Hey, so I was actually in a writing class that you spoke to in 2006
Oh my
in
God.
England. Yeah, and I still really distinctly remember you talking about how to set aside time and space for writing. Sounds like you're still starting your day at 5:30 a.m., which is still, yeah. But
and he spends the afternoon researching the other book he's working on. He writes, right?
Yep.
You write the draft in the morning, and then the afternoon is spent researching for a different book.
Yep.
yeah, so
Books a day.
does that get any easier? And also, how have your writing habits evolved within that routine in the past 13 years?
I'd like to tell you they've evolved. They haven't. It's the same routine. I wish it were different. I wish that I could go to Starbucks at 10 a.m. and write 5 brilliant chapters and then go to the beach or something. I'm not that guy. It just doesn't work that way for me. I'm a grinder. I'm a sort of blue collar kind of worker writer. So I treat it like a job. Never had a job, but this is what I think it might be. And so when the siren goes off, I show up. So I don't have a very interesting answer for you. I'm sorry. I haven't evolved at all since 2006. I'm just the same boring cat that I was then,
I'm curious oftentimes.
Thanks for the question, and nice to see you again. Was it Oxford or Cambridge?
Yes, it was at Oxford.
Cool. Yeah. I'm going to have dinner with Jim Basker later, so.
Oftentimes when writers talk about writing, they just say writing. They say, I wake up and I write. I wake up and I write, or I do this and I write. But they don't often talk about the worst days of writing. What is your worst day of writing like? And how often do you feel it?
I would say about a quarter of the time.
That's not bad.
Not bad. It's like dragging, it's like putting a chain around a cinder block and trying to pull it across an asphalt parking lot. Do you know what I mean? It sounds nasty. It is nasty. It's tiresome. It's stop and start. I know that I'm going to throw virtually everything away that I've done that day. You know, it feels awful. I hate it.
Can I ask, what is the least amount of pages that you put down in a day, or is it just about sitting there for a certain amount of time?
I do it by the clock, not by the page.
So will you have a full morning where there's no page?
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
But at least you're sitting there and you're trying.
I am sitting there writing one bad sentence after another, after another, that's going nowhere, and I know it. But what very often happens is that after 20 or 30 bad attempts, boom, I get a sentence that might change the whole book. Or an idea. You know, what if Nico did this? You know, what if that? And then it starts. But I can't get there if I'm out, you know, in a field of daisies waiting for the muse to land on my shoulder and whisper sweet nothings in my ear. I wish it worked that way. I'd love that. It doesn't for me.
It doesn't really work that way for anybody, I don't think.
Nobody I know.
Yeah.
I know a lot of writers, you know, and it doesn't work for anyone I've actually met.
They're all very pale because they just sit inside in the morning trying to write.
We're extraordinarily boring people, as you've discovered this afternoon. I mean, it's you know, you sit there alone and you make stuff up.
It's a great lie about writers that came out of the Bohemian era, that like writers were these sexual, fun, crazy party guys, like one or two, maybe.
Look, you can't do both.
Like Hemingway was drunk because he had to write.
Right.
Not because he was partying.
Yeah. Look, I'm really dull. I mean, I go to bed early because I'm up early, you know, and I have to do the gig. I have to do the job. That's how you end up with big, fat, obese books like this, you know. And every once in a while, I take a little vacation, but not very often, you know.
I think we have time for one more. What do we got? Hi.
Hi.
So as you probably know, I feel like one of the most difficult parts of being a writer can be receiving criticism, whether that's constructive or not. So I was wondering if you have any advice for aspiring writers on how to receive that criticism and how you can learn from that criticism.
That's a great question. I think a lot of times with aspiring writers get too much advice and too much criticism. You know, they do these peer group things in writing. I've never had a writing class, by the way, but I've seen them on TV. They, you know, you turn your story, you know, whatever, then all your peers critique it, which is a process I refer to as being nibbled to death by ducks. This sounds awful. This is going to sound awful. I have no interest in getting an opinion from people who know as much or less as I do. I'll only go to one or two people who look at my stuff. Right, my very trusted agent and friend, Shane Salerno, who's an A-list screenwriter himself, and my editor at the publishing house. That's it. But I take what they have to say very seriously. Here's another thing that actually Shane and I discovered, that he taught me. Pay real close attention to what they say the problems are, but the solutions they offer are usually the wrong ones.
It's a Neil Gaiman quote that a friend told me last week because I was yelling at him about something that he told me. And he was like, look, Neil Gaiman says, whenever someone tells you a problem, they're right. Yeah. Whenever someone tells you the solution to that problem, they're wrong.
Yeah. And then the other thing is you have to take your ego out of it. You know, you got to check your ego at the door. And look, I'll get really upset at some criticism at first. You know, like, how could they say that? You know, it hurts my feelings and I get annoyed and angry. But then I have to know, set it aside for a day and then come back to it and really look at it. I jacked the beginning of this book up like you would not believe. What a mess. And I didn't realize it, you know. And I turned it in, and I got the same comment from both Shane and from my editor. And they were very diplomatic about it. It was very funny, actually. Said, you know, you might want to take a look at the first part of that book. I mean, it might be a little complex, you know. No. I mean, it's not complex. It's perfect. It's this, you know, I worked on it a long time. It's the way it should be.
What are you talking about?
What are you talking about? And then I followed my own advice, which is rare, and I set it aside for a couple of days. And I went back to it, and I went, damn. They're absolutely right. This is overly complex. It's a mess. They didn't offer any solutions, by the way. But then I went back and I looked at it, and I think I fixed it. So they made it a much better book.
Or often, sometimes you have to go and write the fix without realizing that it is going to be the fix.
Yeah.
To see that would be better than the thing you've been defending the whole time.
Right. So don't dig your feet in too hard, but don't listen to too many people. Do you know what I mean? One or two max, because otherwise it's just crazy making. There's too many people in the room.
And also, when you give somebody something to give you notes on, they feel like they have to.
Yeah.
No one is ever going to go, it's great the way that it is, it's brilliant. They're always going to be like, well, I would maybe like this if you did that the different way.
Yeah.
It'll drive you crazy.
It'll make you nuts. Yeah. And sometimes, look, you just have to say, sorry, I never say it. I never say I'm right and you're wrong. But what I do say is, no, this is the book I want to write. If you were to write this, you might write it differently, and that would be good too. But this is the book I want to write, and it's, at the end of the day, my name on it. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Don, I love your work, man. I love when you come in. I love when you put out a new book. It's such a pleasure to get to read your material.
Thank you so much.
I was so happy when this was coming out. When it landed on my desk, I saw how big it was and went, shit. But then as soon as I started reading it, I couldn't put it down. You're the man.
Thank you.
The Border is out on shelves today. Go read it. And if you haven't read the Cartel or The Force or The Power of the Dog, but really the other two books within this trilogy, go read them. But you don't need them necessarily
No, I don't think
for
so.
this.
Right.
But it helps, and it's a great conclusion of the trilogy. Don Winslow,
Thank you
everybody.
so much, man. Appreciate it, Ricky.